Despite protests and a petition sent to President Trump pleading for him not to sign the S.447 Justice for Uncompensated Survivors Today Act, he went ahead and did it anyway. The act, now passed, was put forward to try and force certain countries to pay compensation for the Holocaust. Poland is likely to be one of the main targets of the act because it had the largest Jewish population in Europe and is seen as one of the countries that hasn't done enough to compensate Holocaust survivors. Now, at first glance, you might think, hey, what's wrong with giving compensation to victims of the Holocaust, or their families? It was a terrible tragedy, and if people lost material possessions during that tragedy, surely they should either get those possessions back or be financially compensated for them. Well, in theory, there isn't much wrong with that, but in this particular situation, there are two major stumbling blocks when it comes to this way of thinking. The first concerns the injustice of one nation having to take responsibility for the crimes committed by another nation. The reason so many Jewish people were murdered or forced to flee and leave their properties behind in Poland during the Second World War was because of the Nazi German invasion. After attacking Poland, as well as Jews, the Nazis also killed many non-Jewish Polish people and completely ruined much of the country's infrastructure. So why then should Poland be held responsible for financially compensating Jewish people when if the Nazis hadn't have invaded, Jews would not have lost anything? As well as that, Poland has itself never been compensated by Germany for all of its war crimes. And what about the Polish people who lost property during the Second World War? For those who believe Poland should pay compensation because the Polish state, even though a communist one at the time, did later inherit some properties, why isn't the S447 Act fighting for Poles who fought against the Nazis and had to flee Poland to countries such as the USA, as Polish Foreign Minister Jacek Czaputowicz pointed out? This position of the US Congress isn't good, because it wants some privileges for the Jews, but not for the Poles. Their property here remains without any settlement and nobody speaks on their behalf, only on behalf of the Jews. The second point, however, is probably more important than the first, and people should pay close attention to it. In line with the S447 Act, a report will be conducted over 18 months to determine those countries guilty of having not done enough to compensate Jewish people for the Holocaust. These countries will be evaluated according to the goals and objectives of the Holocaust-era Assets Conference held in the Czech Republic in 2009. The conference resulted in the Terezin Declaration that reached some very particular conclusions. One of these conclusions, in relation to compensation, was that relaxed standards of proof should apply, including the acceptance of alternative forms of evidence for establishing property ownership. Of course, that could be seen as just a way to help Holocaust survivors and their families get compensation on property they no longer have paperwork for. After all, several decades have passed and much of the paperwork might have been left behind in Poland and has since disappeared. The trouble is, relaxed rules of providing proof of ownership could also be a clever way to allow people who aren't rightfully heirs to anything to try claiming compensation too. The irony in all of this is that the relaxed evidence for claims objective might not be that important anyway, because another key conclusion reached during the conference was that heirless properties could still be claimed by Jewish organisations. This is clearly outlined in the S447 Act that says, in the case of heirless property, compensation should be paid to assist needy Holocaust survivors, to support Holocaust education, and for other purposes. What are these other purposes, and who will check if the money given to the Jewish organisations, who are of no blood relation to the Jewish Holocaust survivors or their families, actually goes to needy Holocaust survivors and Holocaust education? Does it not seem a little sinister that somebody would be able to claim compensation for a property based solely on the fact that they are the same ethnicity as the previous owner of the property? Try to picture a scenario where some Polish people lived in Israel decades ago and then for one reason or another were forced to flee the country and leave everything behind. Those people have since passed away and they had no next of kin, so the Israeli state claimed their properties. Now some Polish organisation, in no way related to the Poles who lived in Israel, demand that Mr. Netanyahu and his government give them money for those properties because, you know, their owners were Polish, and they're also Polish. They'd probably be told to stick their demands where the sun don't shine. It's one thing to compensate Jewish Holocaust survivors or their families. It's something completely different to give money to organisations who essentially had nothing to do with the Jews who lived in Poland all those years ago.